9 years ago, a fire in a London tower block killed 72 people, and the promise that followed, from government, from developers, from the entire building industry, was that this would never be allowed to happen again, and that every unsafe building in the country would be identified, funded, and fixed. 9 years later, tens of thousands of flats across England are still wrapped in the same category of dangerous cladding that caused that fire. Thousands of leaseholders are still legally trapped inside buildings nobody will insure properly. And the government's own regulators is still sitting on a backlog of live safety cases that would take years to clear, even if not a single new case was added from this point forward. The headlines moved on a long time ago. The problem did not. I have been tracking the UK property and building safety crisis for years. And this video exists because I keep meeting people who genuinely believe the cladding scandal is a closed chapter, something resolved back in the early 2020s through funding announcements and new regulations. It is not closed. It has simply gone quiet, and quiet is not the same as solved. In the next few minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly where this crisis actually stands today, what has genuinely improved, what has barely moved at all, and why, for a significant number of leaseholders, the second half of this decade could turn out to be worse than the first. Let's start with the scale of what we are actually talking about, because the numbers involved have always been difficult for people to fully absorb. In the years immediately following the disaster, government surveys identified many thousands of residential buildings across England requiring some form of external wall or fire safety remediation, ranging from the most dangerous aluminium composite cladding systems down through a much wider range of secondary defects, missing fire breaks, combustible insulation, inadequate compartmentation that only came to light once buildings were properly inspected for the first time. That combined figure runs into many tens of thousands of individual flats held by ordinary leaseholders sitting inside buildings that, in a huge number of cases, are still not fully remediated today. The building safety regulator's own most recent disclosures continue to reference well over 100 live cases under active investigation or in dispute, covering tens of thousands of individual homes, a backlog that has barely shrunk in proportion to how much time has passed since it was first created.
To put a human face on this scale for a moment, consider the trajectory a typical affected leaseholder has actually lived through. They bought their flat in good faith, often as their very first property, at a price that reflected a completely normal, unremarkable market at the time. Within a year or two of the original disaster, they received a letter informing them their building required inspection. That inspection, in a large share of cases, took months rather than weeks to actually happen, because the number of qualified inspectors available nationally was never remotely sufficient for the number of buildings suddenly requiring urgent assessment. Once inspected, many buildings were found to need remediation, triggering a funding application process that itself frequently took a year or more to resolve, followed by a tendering and contractor appointment process, followed by the physical works themselves, which for a larger building can easily run 18 months to 2 years once finally underway. Add those stages together, honestly and without exaggeration, and it becomes obvious why so many leaseholders are now looking at a timeline stretching from an initial letter to a fully resolved, freely mortgageable flat that spans the better part of a decade, not the months or single years that early government announcements originally implied. Red flag number 1, the funding gap that never actually closed. The government did commit genuinely significant sums toward remediation funding in the years following the disaster, and to be fair, that funding has paid for meaningful remediation work on a real number of buildings, but the funding was always structured around specific categories, primarily the most dangerous aluminium composite cladding on the tallest buildings, and it left enormous gaps around medium-rise buildings, around secondary defects discovered during deeper inspections, and around buildings where the original developer could not be identified or had gone insolvent in the years since construction. Leaseholders in those gaps have spent years caught between a developer denying responsibility, a freeholder unwilling to fund work without a clear paying party, and a government scheme that technically exists but that their specific building does not cleanly qualify for. The result for a meaningful share of affected leaseholders has been years of limbo, watching remediation happen in the building down the road while their own building's case sits unresolved. Red flag number 2, the developer pledge that looks stronger on paper than in practice. A significant number of major developers signed a formal pledge committing to fund or arrange remediation of buildings they were responsible for constructing, and in fairness, this pledge did shift meaningful costs away from leaseholders and onto developer balance sheets. What the pledge did not do is create a fast, uniformly enforced process. developers control the pace of their own remediation programs, and in practice, the buildings that get prioritized are not always the ones leaseholders would choose, but the ones that make the most commercial or reputational sense for the developer to address first. Leaseholders in buildings from smaller developers or from developers that have since gone through corporate restructuring, insolvency, or been acquired and absorbed into other companies frequently find themselves negotiating with a legal entity that bears little resemblance to the company that actually built their home, and that has correspondingly little practical incentive to move quickly. In some documented cases, leaseholders have spent years attempting to establish which legal entity is even currently responsible for their building, only to discover the answer has changed more than once during the course of their own correspondence, each change effectively resetting months of prior progress back to a starting point. Red flag number 3, the insurance spiral I have detailed in previous videos, which continues to compound this crisis rather than easing it. Even in buildings where remediation work has been agreed and funded and is genuinely underway, insurance premiums for buildings with any cladding history at all remain dramatically elevated compared to pre-crisis levels, in some cases running many multiples higher than they were before the issue came to light. That elevated premium flows directly through to leaseholders via their service charge, meaning a leaseholder in a building actively being fixed is often still paying a service charge bill that reflects years of accumulated risk perception long after the physical remediation work itself has genuinely reduced the underlying danger. Insurers, understandably cautious after years of high-profile claims and reputational risk in this sector, have been slow to reprice buildings downward even once remediation is substantially complete, which means the financial pain of this crisis regularly outlasts the physical safety problem that originally caused it. Red flag number 4, the secondary defects nobody budgeted for. When surveyors finally gained proper access to conduct detailed intrusive inspections on affected buildings, a huge number of them uncovered problems that had nothing directly to do with the original cladding material. Missing or inadequate fire breaks between floors, combustible insulation behind what looked from the outside like perfectly ordinary render, balconies constructed with combustible materials, and timber cladding systems that had never been publicly associated with the original crisis but that carry very similar underlying fire risk. Each of these secondary defect categories has, at different points, triggered its own smaller wave of newly affected buildings and newly affected leaseholders, years after the original crisis was supposedly identified and being addressed, because the true scope of the problem was never actually known until buildings were inspected floor by floor, wall by wall, a process that is still ongoing in a meaningful number of buildings across the country today. Red flag number 5, the mortgage and mobility trap that has barely improved. As I have covered in detail in previous videos, a flat in a building with any live, unresolved fire safety question remains extremely difficult and in many cases effectively impossible to mortgage or remortgage on normal terms. The introduction of a standardized external wall fire review form was meant to give lenders a consistent, reliable way to assess this risk, and to some extent it has helped clarify cases at the safer end of the spectrum. But for buildings still under active investigation, still awaiting funding decision, or still working through a lengthy developer negotiation, that form frequently cannot be completed with a clean result, leaving the underlying mortgage problem exactly where it was years ago. Leaseholders trapped in this category cannot sell because no buyer's lender will approve a mortgage. They cannot easily remortgage themselves for the same reason. They are simply waiting, often for years at a stretch, for a resolution timeline that is largely outside their own control. Red flag number 6, the legal protections that sound stronger than they function in practice. Legislation was introduced specifically to protect qualifying leaseholders from having to personally pay for historic cladding and building safety remediation costs, capping or in many qualifying cases eliminating their exposure. This was, on paper, a genuinely significant improvement for a large number of leaseholders. In practice, qualifying for that protection depends on a specific set of conditions relating to when the lease was granted, the value of the property, and how many properties the leaseholder owns, and a meaningful number of leaseholders have found themselves excluded from full protection on technical grounds they did not anticipate when the legislation was first announced. Freeholders and their lawyers in a number of documented cases have also been slow or resistant to formally applying the protection, requiring leaseholders to actively assert their rights, sometimes through formal legal process, rather than having the protection applied automatically and without a fight. Red flag number 7, the sheer duration of this crisis and what that duration has done to ordinary lives. It is worth pausing on the human dimension here, because the financial and technical details, while important, can obscure just how long many affected leaseholders have now been living with this uncertainty. A person who bought a flat in the early 2010s in a building that only came under scrutiny after the Grenfell disaster has now potentially spent close to a decade unable to sell, unable to move for work or family reasons, watching remediation timelines slip repeatedly, and often paying substantially inflated insurance costs throughout the entire period. Surveys of affected leaseholders conducted over the years have consistently documented significant impacts on mental health, relationships, and major life decisions. People delaying having children, delaying career moves, delaying retirement plans because their single largest asset has been functionally frozen for years at a time, with no reliable date attached to when that will change. Some affected leaseholders have described the experience as living in a permanent state of financial suspended animation, technically owning a valuable asset on paper while being unable to access, borrow against, or realize any of that value in practice, a strange and psychologically exhausting position that most ordinary financial hardship, however severe, does not typically involve.
Red flag number 8, the Remediation Acceleration Plan and why targets keep slipping. Government has periodically announced acceleration plans and specific target dates by which it expects the majority of affected buildings to be remediated. These targets have a consistent pattern of being missed, not through any single dramatic failure, but through the accumulated effect of every other red flag on this list. Funding disputes dragging on, developers moving at their own pace, secondary defects being discovered mid-project and extending timelines, and a genuinely limited supply of qualified contractors and surveyors capable of doing this specialized remediation work at the volume required. Each missed target has been followed by a new target, generally further into the future than the one it replaced, a pattern that has repeated often enough now that industry observers increasingly treat any newly announced completion date with considerable skepticism rather than confidence. Red flag number 9, the sheer bottleneck of qualified professionals capable of doing this work at all. Every stage of this process, from the initial fire risk assessments through to the specialist fire engineers required to sign off completed remediation and the accredited contractors qualified to actually carry out the physical works, depends on a genuinely small, specialist pool of professionals across the entire country. That pool did not exist at anything like the scale required when this crisis first emerged, and building it up, training new fire engineers, accrediting new remediation contractors has taken years and continues to lag well behind the volume of buildings requiring their services. This bottleneck alone would be enough to explain a meaningful share of the delay running through every other red flag on this list, because even a building with fully agreed funding and a fully cooperative freeholder can still find itself waiting many months simply for the right specialist to become available to sign off the next stage of the process.
Now here is the part that connects all of these red flags together, and it is a part that explains why this crisis has quietly persisted for so long without generating the same level of public attention it did in its early years. Each individual red flag on its own sounds like a manageable, bounded problem, a funding gap here, a slow developer there, a secondary defect discovered in one particular building. Stacked together across tens of thousands of individual flats and hundreds of individual buildings, they form a system with no single point of accountability and no single lever that any one actor, government, developer, or leaseholder can pull to meaningfully accelerate the whole process. Everyone involved can point with some justification to everyone else as the reason for the delay, and in the meantime, the leaseholders at the center of it, the people who did nothing wrong beyond buying a flat that later turned out to have been built or certified incorrectly, continue to carry the practical, daily consequences of a crisis that the country has largely stopped talking about. I spoke with a leasehold campaigner who has spent years supporting affected residents, and off the record, her assessment was sobering. She said the hardest part of her work now is not explaining the technical details of the crisis. Most affected leaseholders understand those details better than most journalists to this point, but managing the emotional toll of a process that has no reliable end date. She said she regularly speaks with residents who were told years ago that their building would be fully remediated within a specific time frame, watched that time frame pass, were given a new time frame, watched that pass too, and have simply stopped believing any date they are given, treating every new promise with a kind of exhausted skepticism that she said is entirely rational given what they have already lived through. She also made a point that stuck with me, which is that the newer leaseholders, people buying into affected buildings today at a steep discount because they know exactly what they are getting into, are in some ways in a stronger position than the original owners, precisely because they went in with clear eyes and a price that already reflects the risk, whereas the original owners bought at full market price, in good faith, with no idea any of this was coming. She described one particularly striking case, a couple who had been trying to sell their flat for close to 3 years, watching two separate buyers walk away after their respective lenders declined to mortgage the property before finally securing a sale to a cash buyer, a landlord specifically targeting affected buildings at a price roughly 40% below what comparable unaffected flats in the same area were achieving. She said stories like that one are not unusual. They are close to the median experience for leaseholders who eventually do manage to sell before their building's case is fully resolved, and that the couple involved described the sale, despite the enormous loss, as one of the most relieving days of their adult lives, simply because it finally ended years of uncertainty they had stopped believing would ever conclude.
She also raised a point about the psychological toll that goes beyond simple financial stress. She described leaseholders who had become, in her words, accidental experts in fire safety legislation, external wall survey methodology, and building insurance underwriting purely out of necessity, spending evenings and weekends researching regulations that had nothing to do with their actual careers or interests, because nobody else was going to do that research on their behalf with the same urgency. That unpaid, unrecognized expertise, she said, has become one of the quiet, uncounted costs of this entire crisis, alongside the more visible financial ones, hours and years of ordinary people's lives spent becoming reluctant specialists in a field they never wanted anything to do with. So, what does this actually mean if you are currently living inside this crisis, or if you are considering buying into a building with any cladding or fire safety history? First, if you already own in an affected building, request a clear, written update directly from your freeholder or managing agent on the exact current status of your building's case, including whether it has secured funding, which scheme or route that funding is coming through, and what the current projected timeline is. And request this in writing, specifically so you have a documented record to refer back to as timelines inevitably shift. Second, check specifically whether you qualify for the leaseholder protection provisions under current legislation, because the qualifying criteria are genuinely technical and do not simply assume you are covered or excluded without actually checking the specific conditions against your own lease and circumstances. Third, if you believe you qualify for protection, but your freeholder is not applying it or is still billing you for costs that should be covered, seek advice from a specialist leasehold advice service or solicitor, because in a meaningful number of documented cases, leaseholders have had to actively assert these rights rather than having them applied automatically. Fourth, if you are considering buying into a building with any cladding or fire safety history, however minor it sounds, get a completely clear-eyed view of the current remediation status and funding position before proceeding. Treat any verbal reassurance from an estate agent with real skepticism, and insist on seeing the actual current external wall fire review documentation, or the lack of it, before you commit. Fifth, if you are part of a residents association, or if your building does not yet have one, consider commissioning your own independent legal and technical review of your building's case status, because a well-organized, well-informed residents group is consistently more effective at pushing a stalled case forward than individual leaseholders working alone and separately. Sixth, keep meticulous records of every cost you have personally incurred as a result of your building's cladding or safety status, elevated insurance premiums, mortgage-related fees, valuation costs, legal fees, because as remediation schemes and leaseholder protection provisions continue to evolve, having a clear, dated record of your own financial exposure puts you in a considerably stronger position to claim back costs retrospectively if and when a relevant scheme or legal route becomes available to you. Seventh, if your mental health or that of your household has been meaningfully affected by the prolonged uncertainty this crisis creates, treat that as a legitimate consequence worth addressing directly, whether through your own support network or a professional, rather than something to simply push through silently. because the sustained, low-grade stress of an unresolved, years-long housing crisis is a genuinely different and often more corrosive experience than a single acute financial shock, and it deserves to be taken seriously in its own right. Here is how I expect this to develop over the next few years. Expect the total number of fully remediated buildings to continue rising steadily, because genuine progress has been made and continues to be made, but expect the pace of that progress to remain slower than any officially announced target for the same structural reasons that have caused every previous target to slip. Expect secondary defect discoveries to continue emerging periodically as more buildings undergo detailed, intrusive inspection for the first time, meaning the total scope of this crisis may not yet be fully known even now, nearly a decade in. Expect insurance premiums for previously affected buildings to decline only gradually and considerably more slowly than the underlying physical risk actually improves, meaning the financial burden on leaseholders will likely persist for years after their buildings are technically declared safe. And expect continued political and media attention to arrive in occasional spikes, usually triggered by a specific new revelation, a large insolvency, a newly discovered defect category, a leaseholder taking a particularly high-profile legal case, rather than as a sustained, continuous spotlight, which means the burden of tracking your own building's progress will likely continue falling primarily on affected leaseholders themselves, rather than on any external party consistently doing it for them. There is also a slower-moving legal dimension worth watching closely over the next few years, as the various class action style and group litigation efforts brought by leaseholders against developers, freeholders, and in some cases building product manufacturers continue working their way through the courts. Group litigation of this scale and technical complexity moves slowly by its very nature, often taking years to reach a resolution even once filed, but a small number of significant rulings or settlements over the next few years could meaningfully shift the balance of financial responsibility in ways that individual leaseholders negotiating alone have never been able to achieve. Watching how these cases progress and understanding whether your own building or developer is party to any relevant litigation is likely to become an increasingly important part of tracking your own building's path toward resolution, alongside the more familiar remediation and funding milestones already covered in this video. It is also worth considering how this crisis is likely to shape buyer behavior and pricing across the wider leasehold market for years to come, well beyond the specific buildings directly affected. A generation of buyers who lived through this crisis, either directly as leaseholders or indirectly through friends and family who did, are now approaching property purchases with a level of scrutiny around building safety, freeholder identity, and managing agent reputation that simply did not exist as a mainstream consumer concern before the disaster. That shift in buyer behavior is itself becoming a permanent structural feature of the leasehold flat market, quietly increasing the due diligence burden and, in many cases, the due diligence cost attached to every leasehold transaction, not just the ones directly touched by cladding history. A kind of lasting cultural residue from this crisis that will likely outlast the physical remediation work itself by a considerable margin. The uncomfortable truth underneath all of this is that 9 years is not a temporary crisis. It is now a permanent feature of the UK property market, one that has quietly become normalised precisely because it has lasted so long that its continued existence no longer generates headlines the way it once did. If you own in an affected building or are considering buying into one, the single most valuable thing you can do is stop waiting passively for someone else to resolve this on your behalf and instead treat active, persistent, documented pursuit of your own building's case status as an ongoing part of managing your home, in the same way you would manage any other significant, long-running financial exposure. The scandal was never actually resolved. It simply moved out of the headlines and into the quiet, grinding day-to-day reality of the people still living inside it. If you take one thing from this video, let it be a refusal to accept silence as evidence of progress. A building that has not been in the news for years is not necessarily a building that has been fixed. A leaseholder who has not received an update in months is not necessarily a leaseholder whose case is quietly nearing resolution. In a crisis this large, this technically complex, and this dependent on a genuinely limited pool of specialists and funding routes, the absence of bad news is worth almost nothing on its own. The only reliable signal is direct, documented, persistently pursued information about your own specific building, obtained and reobtained on your own timeline, rather than whenever your freeholder or managing agent happens to get around to volunteering it. 9 years in, that is still the single most practical piece of advice available to anyone still living inside this crisis, because nobody else is coming to chase this on your behalf with the same urgency you can bring it to it yourself.